on, was it Friday? We talked about the Industrial Revolution, and we talked about how that boom in manufacturing jobs and all of the changes in transportation industry that made it so railroads and steamships and all of that were carrying goods all over the place. Good morning. All of those changes in the structure of the way that industry worked in America caused, among other things, a big boom in immigrants. So we're going to talk a little bit today about some of the groups of immigrants that came in and why everybody hated them so much. To do that, we also have to talk about the nativists. And just to be clear, because I know we talked about the Trail of Tears a lot last week, nativists in this context are people who believe themselves to be native to America because they were born here, even though you only have to go back a couple of generations to find an immigrant in their family. So we're talking about white people who think that they are native to America because they were born here, and that people who are coming in are not, and therefore they should have more rights. So my family, for example, on one side of my family, we've been here since about the 1820s. We moved straight from poor places in England to poor places in the Appalachians, and that whole side of my family is still like that. That's the side of my family I joke about the family tree being all tangled up, because they are, basically. The other side of my family came in the early 1800s from Scotland and came directly to Texas. So when they arrived, what they met were people who had been here for a couple of generations who said, we are natives and you are not, okay? I personally think it's really funny that they call themselves natives, because it's so close to when immigration took place. But in some of these cases, they've been here since the late 1600s. So they've been here for, at this point, they've been here for 200 years. Their family's been here for 200 years. You know, so there's a reason they think this of themselves. But just for the sake of clarity, we're not talking about any of the Amerindians. We're not talking about any of the tribal peoples. We're talking about nativists. We're talking about white people who think that they, you know, are native to America because they were born here. Any questions about that before I get going on the rest of it? Okay, because we're gonna examine how nativists feel about things, and I didn't want it to get confusing. Okay, one piece of vocabulary that I need you to know is this word diaspora. Does anybody know what a diaspora is? It's up there, so you should know. We have several different instances of this. A diaspora is when you take people from their homeland, people that, you know, have their roots in a specific area, and then for one reason or another, you suddenly scatter them across the world. In most cases, when we're talking about a diaspora, in some cases you scatter them across a large area. There are a couple of different diasporas that we talk about in history quite frequently. The Jews have, I think, 2 or 3 different diasporas. They have Jews were driven out from all over Europe during the plague. Jews were rounded up and then moved out of where they lived and forced to scatter after World War II, after the Holocaust. So we have several Jewish diasporas. The biggest diaspora is the African diaspora, when tens of millions of people were moved from their homes in Africa to work in slavery on all of the continents. And most of them, of course, went to South and Central America. A large chunk went to North America, but they also went to China, and they also went to the Middle East, and they also went up to Europe, and they also went down to Australia. So the biggest diaspora is in Africa. But we're going to talk about the Irish diaspora. We're going to talk about the Irish and how they got kicked out of their homeland, and why there are literally Irish people on every single continent. Say what? Yes, we're talking about immigrants and nativists, and we're going to talk specifically about the Irish. I'm not going to do that for much longer because it hurts my face. Okay, so there are several different reasons why the Irish moved out of Ireland and moved over to America. The first thing you have to understand is the Irish have been harassed by the English for several centuries. There was never really a good friendly relationship between the English and the Irish. they're the island next door. Okay, so this is Britain and this is Ireland, but Ireland is zoomed in. So this is Britain and this is Ireland, but Ireland is much smaller, but they're like close enough that you could hop from one to the other, you know, in a small amount of sailing. And so they've always been at each other's throats. Yeah, actually, there are still Irish terrorist groups trying to drive the English out today. Like there's still the functioning of the Irish Republican Army is still in force today, committing acts to try to get England to leave them alone. And especially after Brexit, because Ireland didn't want to have anything to do with Brexit. The part of that has to do with religion. In the 1600s, when after in the 1500s, when King Henry left the Catholic Church and established the Anglican Church, Ireland was still mostly Catholic. That word Catholic is going to come up several times today. Have I mentioned to y'all what that word actually means? Have we talked about that?
Universal.
It means universal, crossing all borders. So the reason that that's important is because if you believe yourself to be a part of something that crosses all borders, then it's very hard for you to convince somebody that you're loyal to something that fits within a border. So if you identify yourself as Catholic, that means your loyalty is to a big structure that supersedes, for example, the King of England, who thinks he's in charge of you, or Queen of England, and some of this time it's the Queen of England. But to clamp down on this sentiment of loyalty to the Vatican and Rome, the English begin to pass laws on the territories that they control. And in the early 1600s, they very definitely controlled Ireland. They had managed to move Scottish people, basically, who were making trouble for them in northern England, over to Ireland so they could make trouble for people in Ireland instead. And as a result, they had managed to clamp down on the productivity of Ireland, so that Ireland was basically just another cash crop colony of England. That was like basically their job. They made things and English people took them. Their loyalty to the Catholic Church made them particularly vulnerable because it was really easy for Puritans in Parliament to say, anyone who disobeys this rule will have to live under a new set of, anybody who swears loyalty to the Catholic Church will have to obey a whole set of other rules that don't have anything to do with religion. And since they knew that most of England had already become Anglican, that if they're targeting the Catholics, that they're targeting Ireland. So anybody who was a Catholic was not allowed to vote, hold office, practice law, or serve in the military. Anybody who was Catholic was not allowed to own land, own good horses, and I would be interested to find out who gets to make the determination on what's a good horse and what's not, or own firearms. And anybody who's a practicing Catholic is not allowed to acquire foreign education, send their children off to college in Paris, for example, or adopt children. Okay?
The church has been controlling stuff for a long time.
Well, the Anglican Church specifically trying to drive out the Catholics, and the Puritans specifically trying to drive out Catholics they were pretty merciless. I mean, but this was not just about that. This was just an easy way to control a population. The Irish population was difficult to control because, I don't know if you know this about Irish people, but they're kind of troublesome. So temperamental, some might say. So the laws that they were making, they knew would hit the bulk of the Irish population because the Irish population continued to insist on being Catholic. Okay, so another law that made it really easy for English to seize control in Ireland was that when Irish Catholic landholders died, their land was split between all their male relatives. Okay, so if you are Catholic, I don't know, I grew up Catholic, so I have all kinds of opinions about this, but Catholic people tend to have a lot of kids for some reason. So if you're the father of 5 strapping young boys and you die, then your land is split up between all of those 5 boys, plus all of your nephews, plus all of your male cousins. So if you had 100 acres that belong just to you, when you die, it becomes a bunch of little tiny pieces of land. Unless you happen to have one Protestant male relative, in which case he gets the whole thing. So what that did was that split the ability to build power off of land and kind of tore it up. And English Protestants then kind of grabbed land on a regular basis because of this. Okay, another way that they ran into problems was in what was called the tithe wars. A tithe is 10% of all of your income. A lot of people, if they belong to a church, they put offering money in the plate, they call it a tithe, but the actual amount is supposed to be 10% of all of your income. Catholics believe that if they don't pay their tithe, they're committing a really heinous sin. So they really feel the need to pay their tithe. The Anglican Church insisted that the tithe be paid to the Anglican Church. So what would happen is that the Irish Catholics would pay their Catholic priest, and then the Catholic priest would have to hand over the tithe to the Anglicans. So to the Catholics, to the Irish Catholics, that meant that their money wasn't going where it was supposed to, in their opinion. It wasn't going to support the church they were a part of. So eventually they had nonviolent protests, which is kind of amazing considering they're Irish, but nonviolent protests in which over, hundreds of thousands of people gathered to basically just get in the way of the Anglican tithe collector so that he couldn't come to the priest and get the tithe from them. And they did this all over Ireland. And so in order to fix that, the English government rewrote the tithe laws so that instead of giving your tithe to the Catholic Church and then having the Catholic Church get it seized by the Anglican Church, they would say, you owe a tithe to the Anglican Church, it's now a part of your rent. Since you can't own land if you're a Catholic, everywhere you live and every land you work is rented. So we'll just up your rent by 10% of your income, and now you have to pay that along with your rent. So your tithe is not even connected to what you put in the offering plate at church anymore. So things have been rough for the Irish for a long time. Up until 1845, a lot of Irish young people came over to America for adventure, really. They came over to America as a sort of a rite of passage, leaving and go, because again, they couldn't own land in their own country. So leaving and making your fortune and seeking your adventure and seeking your destiny and all that kind of stuff was just kind of a part of what young people in Ireland did. They figured out, they saved up, they got work on ships that were crossing, they worked as laborers on the ships, and then they landed in America and tried to find work there, and then arrived and basically tried to make enough money so that they could come back home and help their families, but the jobs that they got tended to be such low-paying jobs that they ended up just kind of stuck in America. There was other than just sort of loyalty to your family and everything, there was no real reason for them to feel like Ireland was where they belonged any more than America was where they belonged. In America, at least, there was a chance someday if they pulled together enough money that they might be able to own their own property, that they might be able to own land, they might be able to own a good horse without having it taken away by the English. So sending your young adult children across to find their fortune in America was pretty common before 1845. In 1843, this number changed by quite a bit. And this is why. Okay, so yeah, this is a particular form of blight, and it affects the potato while it's in the ground. So you don't know that it burrows into the inside of the potato. So you don't see it on the skin until after it's been picked and out of the ground for a while, okay? And so what that does is that means that the seeds actually contain the germ of the blight, okay? So the seed potatoes actually contain the germ of the blight and will grow up into full-blown blighted potatoes, which are then basically poisonous and inedible. You can't eat them. Here's an interesting thing I bet you don't know. The blight actually hit all over Europe. This particular blight actually hit all over Europe. Basically, in 1843, this blight started in the Andes, okay? That's all the way over here. My mouse has not got enough space to move. Okay, that's all the way down here. This is where the blight originates, okay? But what happens is that seed potatoes are imported from South America into North America, okay? South and Central America into North America. I'm sorry, it didn't start in the Andes. The Andes are up here, sorry. It started up here. The blight actually started up here. So, it wasn't that the blight itself was new. There was something else that changed that made it possible for a seed potato that was blighted to make it all the way from Central America to Ireland and get planted before anybody knew it was blighted. Anybody know what had changed? Can you guess? Look at the path that the blighted potatoes take and tell me what has changed in this region. Think to last week. No, but we're talking about the 18th. There are no colonies. We're in the States now. All right, think about last week. What happened? What did we talk about changing the face of the states last week? Think more practically. Why would something have traveled suddenly now fast enough from here all the way to here?
The slaves?
Before you knew it was blighted. Say again?
The slaves?
No, the slaves are still pretty much right where they were. What has happened, what has changed in the early 1800s is that Fulton has invented a steam paddle boat that can travel up the Mississippi, north on the Mississippi, and railroads have been built all over New England that have steam-powered engines. So suddenly it's much faster to get things from Central America up the Mississippi to the Ohio River Valley and into the ports of New England, all the way across to Europe. So basically, America's transportation revolution caused the Irish potato famine. Considering the amount of hate that Americans had for Irish people who were fleeing this famine, I just want us to consider that, American transportation innovations actually caused it. Because before that, the blighted potatoes would have arrived somewhere up here and would have been stopped and thrown out before they ever made it to Europe. So anyway, the reason that Ireland is hit the hardest is because Ireland only grows one breed of potatoes. Everywhere else that grows potatoes in Europe, they grow several different breeds. Ireland only grows one, and that's because it's not native to Ireland. They planted potatoes there as a poor people food so that they could take all of the natural crops that grow in Ireland and make those cash crops for Britain. So they basically gave them one crop that they could keep that was theirs, which they brought in from India. And that particular breed of potato happens to be highly susceptible to this blight. So the only food that they're really allowed to keep and eat as much of as they want without turning over most of it to England is this one breed of potato. And this one breed of potato is particularly subject to this blight. England's response to this is basically to let them starve. They're having their own food shortages because the blight also hit some of their crops and some of the crops of the other cash crop colonies that they've set up in other places in the world, and they no longer have cash crop colonies in the United States, and they can't afford to purchase all of the agricultural goods it would take to replace it, so they're not helping the Irish at all. So they depended on this particular potato for food, and then this particular potato was wiped out. So in 1846, 3/4 of the crop was destroyed by this blight. By 1847, 2 million Irish people were dead of starvation and other related illnesses. There are other illnesses that take a greater toll on you if you don't have any nutrition in your body. So not everybody died of starvation, but a lot of people died of weakened immune systems. Between 1814 and 1845, 1.5 million Irish people immigrated to the US in those 31 years. Over 31 years, 1.5 million Irish immigrants moved. In 1 year alone, 1847, 250,000 people moved. Okay, so the Irish immigration situation went from like this to like this in the course of 1 year because they were literally fleeing for their lives from a famine, which they probably don't realize this, but from a famine which basically was caused by American transportation innovation. Anyway, when they arrived, yes. Sure. When they arrived, they found out that they weren't particularly welcome. They were already laborers in the laboring jobs. There were already people who who were standing in line to be the next people who got to work. And the Irish came in such a big flood, and they brought certain things with them that the Native Americans, the Nativist Americans didn't approve of, which we'll talk about separately, because they're not the only wave that's coming in at this point.
I feel like they're the Mexicans of that time.
Kind of. It's not the first. It's not the first, nor will it be the last time that people begin talking about a flood of people stealing our jobs.
Yeah, like the Chinese.
Yes. So it's not. It's not the last time that's going to happen, but that was actually, you know, how they talked about it. People who refused to hire the Irish because there were too many of them, and they also just had a different culture than what they were used to. And we'll talk about that separately. They're not the only group that comes in at this time. There's also a massive uptick in German immigration. And from 1820 to 1840, about 160,000. In those 20 years, about 160,000 German people came in. From 1841 to 1850, so that's 9 years, 434,000 people came in. And from 1851 to 1860, so those 9 years, almost 1 million German immigrants came in. So something is happening in Germany that is causing people to flee and move quickly to America. It's a little bit different than what's happening in Ireland, though. So we have to go across to Europe and talk about something that's happening in 1848. And we talk about this a little bit in my other class. The rise of the Industrial Revolution leads to this class of people who are workers, who basically all they own is their ability to work. Now, those are hourly employees, just like a lot of us are hourly employees that don't own land or anything like that. The only thing that we own is our ability to work, and we sell that by the hour to the highest bidder for whatever we can get, you know, for whatever kind of work we can do. The rise of this, more and more people belonging to that class, we're talking about the proletariat, yes. The growing population of people that belong to that class, and then the fact that if something happens to you and you can't work anymore, you have no other options, causes sort of a rippling effect across Europe. And Karl Marx publishes, along with Engels, publishes his Communist Manifesto during this time. Do I have that in here? No, I don't. Okay. The Communist Manifesto that he publishes specifically points out how imbalanced everything is and how the working class is subject to the people who own the factories, and how, you know, there should be a requirement that they take care of people, and there's not. And so it's all just going to grind people up. And eventually he publishes what's called Das Kapital, which is a book that proposes that eventually what will happen is that there'll be a spark and a revolution, and the working class will seize all the wealth of the rich class and take it and distribute it evenly, and everybody will live happily ever after. And people begin to grasp onto this idea and form groups, parties, socialist parties, working class parties, liberalist parties, and some of them want a total overthrow of the whole system, but most of them just want a little more care for their class. Like, you know, if I get too old to work, I want the government to help take care of me somehow, you know, elder care. If I get sick, I want to know that I can go to a doctor or a hospital and not lose my job, things like that. So a lot of the groups, that's all they want. But some of the groups are much more radical. And the radical ones tend to turn violent. And so there's this wave of revolutions that sweeps all across Europe, starting with like the tip of Spain and going all the way up into northern Germany. Suddenly, major cities are seeing these big revolutions. If you're wondering, this is actually where Les Mis comes in. Who was it that was talking about Les Mis? Was that in this class? That was in the other class. Oh, I'm sorry. Okay. Les Miserables, if you are interested in that, this is the revolution they're talking about. A lot of people think that's about the French Revolution, but it's not. It's about this wave of revolutions that comes through. As a result, families that are actually upper class families, or at least upper middle class families, lower aristocrats or upper middle class families begin to form sort of protective little communities that are like, you know, gated communities within the cities. Like, we're not a part of all that violence out there. We're going to protect each other. And eventually they start looking for a new place to turn. In 1848, Germany forms what's called the Frankfurt Assembly, specifically to address these complaints, like to come up with a new system. And one of the things the Frankfurt Assembly does is it appoints an emperor, okay? Germany now has an emperor, and they take the King of Prussia, Wilhelm, yes, they take the King of Prussia, and they make him basically the emperor of what is now going to be Germany. All these little kingdoms are all going to form into one basic big monster kingdom, and that kingdom is going to be Germany, and it's going to have a German Empire. It's the First Reich of the German Empire. And that empire will provide certain social rights like elder care and health care. The people who organized this were aristocrats, but they were smart. They didn't want people to, they didn't want peasants revolting anymore. They didn't like the revolting peasants. So they began to build something that appeased the working class, but it also meant that anybody who had ties to a royal family that was not Prussian felt very threatened. Okay, so the people that fled out of Germany were mostly political refugees. They were people from Austria, which had fought Prussia in a lot of wars, Bavaria, which had also fought Prussia in several different wars. They were refugees from regions that felt like if the Prussians are taking over, we don't want to be here anymore. And the Prussians were definitely taking over. All of Germany is going to be taken over by the military of Prussia. And so those who had over history had animosity with Prussia didn't want to be there anymore. Also, Luther, who we talked about a little bit in this class, but Luther had most of his effect in the northern part of these kingdoms where the Lutherans are now. In the southern part of the kingdoms, they're still mostly Catholic. So German Catholics are kind of a big, especially in Bavaria, they're very big group. And they, since they're sort of imposing this now new German nationality that is, you know, iron and Vulcan and getting rid of all of those kind of religious affiliations, they feel like they need to flee. The difference is that when Germans immigrate, they tend to move in whole communities. So like, for example, yeah, I mean, there's some places that have such a large pocket of Germans that all, what they would do is they would send people in advance to sort of scope out a community and then purchase land to buy in that region and then move. And then everybody over there would pool their money together to purchase the land and then they'd all move at the same time. So we have whole towns that have, Oktoberfest is the biggest part of the year for them. Have you ever been to one in Texas like Fredericksburg?
Yes, New Braunfels.
New Braunfels is a huge one. That community was actually purchased as a whole by a community in Germany that was Braunfels. So they actually pooled their money together, sent buyers into Texas, scoped out the land down there, because that's a little bit later because Texas is not part of the US yet. But this happened up in the north before it happened in Texas. That was a practice that started in 1848 and kept going. So like Pennsylvania, for example, had a huge pocket of people that moved, and the Pennsylvanians, the people who saw them come through, said, I don't know, they seem to be calling themselves Dutch. What they were actually saying was that they spoke Deutsch. So they were actually not Dutch people, they're actually German people who just got their name messed up by non-German people who met them first. So the entire Pennsylvania Dutch is a pocket of Germans who moved kind of all of it as a community. They,
They're really big on family names.
oh yeah.
My sister married into the Murdochs down in New Braunfels.
Oh, okay. Well, if you ever take my cultural history of Texas class, we talk about that in great detail. So they also tended to stay very loyal to their language. They tended to stay very loyal to their church. And they also tended to just arrive with more money. So they didn't immediately need to start scraping for lowest paying jobs that they could find like the Irish did. And they turned their nose up at what the English, you know, Anglo-Americans called education, because they had always been very strong on education in their home country. So they began to immediately establish private schools. And so they formed these little isolated, you know, I don't want to say snobbish, self-protective communities in Germany. And then they moved those to America, okay? So the Nativists who live in America at this time have two waves of people coming at them. They have the Irish coming at them, who are just a flood of needy people who have nothing and need everything. And then they have the German people who come in needing very little, but also not really wanting to associate very much with them. Okay, so Nativists at this point are mostly people who came from England. They came from England to Jamestown, they came from England to Massachusetts Bay, or they came to England to Chesapeake Bay. They came with those colonizers and they began to build communities based on that, but they mostly come from England. Anybody who considers themselves native at this point probably came from England. So naturalization is what happens when you are become a citizen without having been born in America. Okay. Okay. Jordan is an example of a naturalized citizen. Where are you from originally? Okay, so from Thailand to America, you go through a process, you become a naturalized citizen. There's several different paths to that. Most of them are complicated. Most of them require a certain amount of education. The reason for that is because over time, the American government has tried several times to limit who can become a naturalized citizen. You don't just come through, sign your name in a ledger, and that's it. You have to prove somehow that you do belong here. In the beginning, you just had to live here for 2 years and be white. In 1790, the first Naturalization Act, which happened like right after the Revolutionary War. They immediately, during George Washington's presidency, they immediately established who could become a naturalized citizen. John Adams, if you remember, made a caveat that made it possible for him to kick out aliens that were dangerous even during peacetime, the Alien Act, which Jefferson then tossed. In 1798, it bumped up the residence to 5 years. You had to be here for 5 years in order to qualify as a citizen. This should be 1796 and this should be 1798. So I'll fix that later. In 1796, it was 5 years. In 1798, it was 14 years. And the reason for that was because as soon as they started making a way for people to come and become citizens, immigrants came and started trying to become citizens. So they immediately bumped up the requirement. In 1802, they made that 5 years requirement with 3 years notice of intent. So you had to declare your intention to become a citizen. 3 years later, you could then apply to become a citizen after 5 years. So it's a total of 8 years. Oh, and no British soldiers are allowed to become citizens because they're still salty in 1802 about the Revolutionary War. But overall, even since like the 1790s, there's always been this fear of Catholics. So the Irish group that is coming in is wildly Catholic, like so many of them are Catholic. Most of the Germans that are fleeing and coming in are Catholics. There are also Catholic immigrants coming from Italy, and there are Catholic immigrants coming in from the Slavic states. That's like Eastern Europe that are still associated with the Catholic Church. There are actually people coming from like Poland that are associated with the Eastern Orthodox Church, but that looks Catholic enough that it's scary in and of itself too, to people who are afraid of Catholics. So why would they be afraid of Catholics? What is so scary about a Catholic? Anybody want to venture a guess? Well, there's the fact that they're patriarchal, okay? There's the fact that they have a loyalty to a patriarchal structure. So in the Catholic Church, you have the Pope, and then you have cardinals, and then you have bishops, and it's all kind of tied into this sort of paternal kind of thing. So, and it goes all the way down to the local priest. Okay, so the local priest answers to the local bishop, who answers to the local cardinal, who answers to the archbishops, who answers to the archcardinals, who answers to the Pope. But your loyalty to your priest is a way of reflecting your loyalty to the Pope, because it's all part of the same tree. What that means is that within families, the way that this is reflected is that the fathers of the families are like the heads of the households, but then they're also connected to each other. So you're more likely in a strongly Irish community that's all tied to the same church. And I don't know if anybody who's not non-Catholic knows this, but Catholics can't start their own churches, okay? Yeah, it all has to come down from the top. So like if you are a member of First Baptist Church of Texarkana and First Baptist Church of Texarkana has a disagreement and splits, they just form a new church. And now right across the street, you've got First Baptist Church of Texarkana and First Christ Baptist Church of Texarkana, which actually were the same church once upon a time. But that's because they made a decision as a congregation to split and start a new church. Huh?
They split 3 times?
I'm making this up.
Oh, okay.
I don't know anything about it. Did y'all ever hear the joke about that? I don't have time to tell a joke, do I? No. Okay. Anyway. Yeah. Sorry, there's a joke about that I think is funny. But the point is that if there's a disagreement within a Catholic church, they don't get to just split off and start a new Catholic church. And you can't just stop attending church because that's a sin. So you have to keep going to the church even though there are disagreements until the diocese agrees to make a new church. And the only reason they would do that is because the geography and the population requires a new church. Okay, so loyalty within the community is very strong to the Catholic Church. So that's one of the reasons why they're so scary, because they seem like a mass that if they all agreed on one thing, they'd be very dangerous. Okay, so nativists who are Protestant find that kind of scary for some reason. They're also anti-Republican, meaning that they don't particularly want to see power in representative democracy. They want to see power come down from above to the hierarchy. So it's hard to rally them behind, like, for example, states' rights causes. It's hard to get them to be big on states' rights. They are wildly alcoholic. And I don't mean that they suffer from alcoholism. I mean that the reverence of alcohol at events, at family gatherings, as a holy sacrament is kind of a big part of the communities that are Catholic. And they come bearing their love for alcohol, and then they begin alcohol industries. That's where, I don't know if you ever read off the names of the top 5 beers you can think of, they're all German. So these are industries that were started by immigrants and then, you know, hooked an entire country on them. Not that the country wasn't already drinking alcohol, but, you know, well-made German beer became something that was easier and more interesting to get a hold of than Kentucky bourbon. So their love for alcohol makes them a little party kind of people, so it makes them a little temperamental and difficult to deal with. And one thing that absolutely drives nativist Americans crazy is that they are loyal to the Pope, who is not the president of the United States. So how can they be, you know, loyal to the president of the United States? If the Pope ever told them to defy the president, then they would, because they're more loyal to the Pope than they are to the president. Now, like I said, I grew up Catholic and I have opinions about that. Like, I don't think the two actually ever cross. I don't think the Pope actually does that, but I am not Catholic anymore, so I'm not gonna say anything else about that. So you remember how we had all of these presidential candidates that were all Democratic Republican, and then Andrew Jackson came along, and then suddenly there were national Republicans and Jacksonian Democrats, and we basically have 2 different parties. Well, one of those parties, the National Republicans, decides to rename themselves. They give themselves a new nickname, which is the Whigs. The Whigamirs of Scotland were resistance fighters that fought the English and lost, basically. But they were bold and they were, you know, creatures of legend. So it was worth it to call yourselves after them, the Whigamirs. Why they called themselves that has to do with something that has its roots in ancient Celtic language. We're not going to get into that, but they decided to call themselves after these freedom fighters in Scotland. And what they're fighting for their freedom against is all of these immigrants. They are anti-immigrant, they are anti-Catholic, they're terrified of the Catholics, they're terrified of the waves of immigrants. They want laws to be passed. It makes it harder for immigrants to get in and easier to deprive them of work so that they can protect the Native Americans, so they can protect the people who are native to America, the white people who've been here and Protestanting for all this time. And they are also really specifically united against Andrew Jackson. By this point, Andrew Jackson, in his presidency, Andrew Jackson has made enough enemies with the tariffs by parking even though it was the Southern Democrats that suffered the most from him parking a worship in Charleston, the audacity that he decided to do that makes it so that the National Republicans in the North unite against him. So they're anti-King Jackson, they're anti-immigrant, they're anti-Catholic. Okay, one person who is definitely a Whig, and we're going to talk about him a little bit, is Samuel Morse. Samuel Morse was the man who invented the telegraph. Not really, he just basically borrowed it and then reworked it. You know, I talked about that last week. He borrowed the telegraph, he reworked it and made it so that telegraphing could be something that was done across the ocean because it was a system of clicks and stuff. Samuel Morse was wildly anti-Catholic. Okay, so your reading assignment for this week let me get this open here. Hold on one second. I'm sorry, I stopped screen sharing for y'all. I will, in a minute, I'll open it back up again. Okay, a couple of things about Samuel Morse that you might find interesting. He was a number of things other than an inventor. He was a painter. He liked to go to lectures on electricity. He was highly educated. He painted the official portrait of President Monroe and the official portrait of Marquis de Lafayette. And he invented the click system, and he ran for mayor of New York as a nativist. He actually believed 100% that the Austrian government was subsidizing immigration into America. He believed that it was part of a plot to land Austrian citizens in America so they could take over. And I want you to read about that in your class materials for this week. So let me get this sharing again. Sorry, guys. Okay, let me get this sharing again. Okay, Samuel Morse fears a Catholic conspiracy is what it's called. Okay, and I'm going to ask you a question about it as your assignment for today, but I can guarantee that there'll be another one on the test probably. No, I don't want to edit it. I just want to look at it. Okay, so Samuel Morse fears a Catholic conspiracy. This is a rant that he went on where he explained why it was incredibly dangerous for all of these Irish and German Catholics, especially the Irish. He was specifically about the Irish, because he believed that they were on a mission to destroy the United States. And now you saw starving people, young people without land. Do these seem like an organized force of people marching into America like an army and then taking over the absolute lowest paying jobs that they could get? Okay, well, he believes that they are, and that he believes that they have been sent by the Pope. So I want you to read this. I want you to take a look at this. It's about 2 pages, and it is a little languagey, but I think it's totally readable. And then for your assignment, you're going to answer this question. Samuel Morse uses the metaphor that America is sitting on a mine. Okay? What is buried in that mine, according to Morse? So you're going to have to find where he talks about the metaphor and figure out what he's talking about, what it is that he's so afraid of. What does it mean, and how could it damage the country if it was unearthed, according to Samuel Morse, okay? So read the document, find out what it is that he's talking about. What is it that's going to explode if it sees the open air, and what will happen to America if it does, okay? Any questions?